My name is Don Swearer, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions, which is a rather low, not very visible building just across the street. I'm in my 6th and last year as director, and it's been a great pleasure for me to be here in a post-retirement position as director of the center. One of the great things about being here has been the wide range of marvelously interesting and excellent people that I've been able to meet at Harvard, not only at the Divinity School, but at the Business School and elsewhere. So what's enough? A conversation between Harvard Business and Harvard Divinity Schools. The consequences of global warming, coupled with the current global financial crisis, has prompted, I think, an unprecedented soul-searching about limits, sufficiency, sustainability, conservation, and a challenge, perhaps, to a more is better economic ideology at various levels, I think, at the level of individual lifestyle, and I think also at the level of international and national public policy. This year's Center for the Study of World Religions thematic programming has been built around the general theme, Ecologies of Human Flourishing. It's been an interdisciplinary response on our part to some of the challenges and questions that I think, have been raised by the ecological and economic crisis. Today's conversation, then, between the Harvard Divinity and Harvard Business Schools on this general theme, actually our meeting today recapitulates in the HDS context a panel that was convened last week at the Business School that was attended by a very large standing room, and in fact even more than standing room only crowd in Aldrich Hall. The audience, primarily MBAs, was attentive and engaged, and in the Q&A period after the presentations, I think they pushed our three panelists, Howard Stevenson, Candace Carpenter-Olson, and Dan McCannon, in ways that indicated, to me at least, that the time is overdue for HBS and HDS, faculty and students, to engage in more extensive interactions, not only about best business practices, but about broad, value-laden topics, such as those that are implied by the theme, Ecologies of Human Flourishing. I hope, therefore, that the conversation today, here in this room at the Divinity School and last week at the Business School, will be but the beginning of expanded contact and collaboration between the two schools. I might say, in the parlance of Harvard, it's time for the two tubs to get off their bottoms. These two panels at the Business School and today began initially with conversations among a few divinity and business faculty held at the Business School. Peter Olson, senior lecturer of business administration in the strategy unit at the Business School, has in fact been the prime catalyst that brought these panels to fruition. So at the outset, I want to give my special thanks to you, Peter, for the role that you played in bringing this about. I'm also very grateful to Peter Tufano, the Sylvan C. Coleman Professor of Financial Management and Senior Associate Dean for Planning and University Affairs at the Business School, Tim Butler, who is here in the audience, Senior Fellow of Business Administration and Director of Career Development Programs there, to Jane Smith, our own Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs, and Bruce McEver, founder and former chair of Berkshire Capital, who is currently an MTS student at the Divinity School, who together with Ron Thiemann on our faculty here instigated Business Across Religious Traditions, which is probably better known by its acronym BART. That's the way it appears on our website, at any rate. I'm, of course, particularly thankful and grateful to our three speakers for taking time out of their very busy schedules, not only to do our panel, but a panel last week. Our main speaker this afternoon is Howard Stevenson, Seraphim Rock Baker Foundation Professor of Business Administration, HBS Senior Associate Dean, and director of HBS Publishing. He's held several positions at Harvard, including Vice Provost for University Resources and Planning and Senior Associate Provost, as well as several CEO positions in investment and manufacturing. The author and editor of many books and dozens of articles, including Just Enough, Tools for Creating Success in Your Work and Life, which is the monograph that inspired the title for our panels. Professor Stevenson also serves on several boards of trusts and foundations, including the Boston Ballet, National Public Radio, and the Mount Auburn Hospital. Candace Carpenter Olson, currently founder and CEO of Global Educational Company, spent 6 years as a leader of the National Outdoor Leadership School and course director of Outward Bound after graduating from Stanford in 1975. After her Harvard MBA, she became president of Time Life Video of Time Warner, during which time she won an Emmy Award for her prime time documentary series, Lost Civilizations. She then went on to found iVillage, a pioneer in developing and monetizing online peer communities and a catalyst in bringing women online. With an additional MA from Union Theological Seminary and a Master's of Education from Columbia Teachers College, Candace bridges the worlds of religion, education, and business. Dan McCannon, our third panelist, joined the Harvard Divinity School faculty in 2008 as the Ralph Waldo Emerson Unitarian Universalist Association Senior Lecturer in Divinity. He studies religious movements of social transformation in the United States from the abolitionist era to the present. His first book, Identifying the Image of God, Radical Christians and Nonviolent Power in the Antebellum United States, explores theological understandings of violence and nonviolence among abolitionists, pacifists, and temperance activists. His two subsequent monographs, Touching the World, Christian Communities Transforming Society, and The Catholic Worker After Dorothy, that's Dorothy Day, who we will be referring to, deals with the Camp Hill and Catholic Worker networks of international communities. They will speak in the order of Howard will give the longest address, followed by Dan, and then finally by Candace. I think that's right, isn't that right? So please join me, will you, in welcoming these three very distinguished speakers.
Thank you, Don. It's always interesting to find the control for the... Anybody see the... Oh, here it is. Got it. Well, what I'm going to try and talk about a little bit today is, if you want to turn it on, is stuff that we did for a book. Now, this book came... My background is I have either a checkered career or a very varied one, as came out of the discussion. I came to the Harvard Business School when I was very young. I graduated at 22, and I couldn't get a job, so they kept me on the I did my doctorate, and they kept me on the faculty. And then I got a job, but I couldn't keep it, so I came back. And then I got tenure, and the dean told me to do something important, so I left. And then I came back about 5 years later and went through the tenure process again to work on entrepreneurship, because the dean that I left for said, do something important, and I thought that meant to leave. But the dean who told me to come back said, just do something about entrepreneurship. So over the last 28 years, I sort of got involved in trying to understand entrepreneurship, and it was a one-man show. Now we're the second largest department and have a required course, and so the young people do all the work and have all the ideas, so I had to figure out something else to do. And what I sort of got interested in is, over the years, I had the opportunity to travel around the world and talk in a lot of countries and look at entrepreneurship in a lot of countries. And what you discovered, every country has this expression, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, rice paddies to rice paddies, clogs to clogs in 3 generations, that somehow it's very hard for successful people to have successful children. Now, given that I had 3 boys and my wife had 4 girls, we both married to jerks, therefore I wound up with all of them, and 1 year got to pay tuition at Columbia, Yale, Harvard, Williams, and Bowdoin. I said, okay, after that investment in tuition, I'd really like to make sure that they succeeded. So now what's the problem, Howard? So I figured that I wouldn't make great progress on that, so I asked Laura Nash. Laura is interested in moral philosophy and has a PhD. Some of you know her, I'm sure, and she's always been a person that I've known for a long time, and she always tried to keep me on the straight and narrow, which is a very difficult task. So we started out with a question that is not new. In fact, it's one of the oldest questions in philosophy. What is success? I mean, Aristotle asked it. Go back to Herodotus, and he asked it. It turns out it's a tough question. Is it a state of being? I am successful. Now, as soon as you say that, you're probably on your way not to being successful because you start to relax. It's some unique combination. Everyone in this room can feel successful unless they start comparing each other. And then you start to say, well, you know, Bill Gates is probably told by a lot of people he's handsome, but he really isn't. But I'm sure he's told that he's handsome. But it's some unique combination of our feelings and accomplishments, and we can feel good about ourselves, but it's tough to figure out what it really means. Now, there's another way of looking at it. It's a collection of episodes and scores. I don't know how many applications I've read for the business school that talked about being captain of the football team, or when I did the biggest deal ever done by an associate at Goldman, or there are a whole bunch of scorekeeping mechanisms. Although Herodotus, I think, said, count no man successful till he dies. So, you know, is it your whole life? And then that's not very interesting to declare yourself a success after you die. So, because you can't enjoy that success too much, I think. The other thing is it's really hard to measure. It doesn't fit neatly on any scale. You know, do you measure, how do you weight money against fame, against a bunch of things? And it's hard to measure. It's probably uneven. It certainly is unstable because you can think you're happily married and then all of a sudden your wife decides somebody else would make her more happy. That creates challenges, especially when you're left with 3 boys that are teenagers and you never thought you'd be a single parent. So there's a lot of things that come into the success that make it hard, and you can't freeze it. You can't stop and say, now I'm going to enjoy my success. It just doesn't work that way. So one of the problems is it's both rational and emotional. There's a rational element of success. I can compare myself to other people on many dimensions. But there's an emotional. They say you don't know if you're wealthy till you're richer than your brother-in-law. Now, one way of thinking about it is what I think leads to a lot of problems is many parents, well, there are 2 ways to be a good marksman. One is you practice a lot, and the other is you fire a bullet and then you draw the circles around it. And whatever I was good at is what success is defined as. Now, we never see that in academia at all. None of my colleagues ever say, unless you publish in the journals that I've published in, you're not a success. Well, you know, some of those journals nobody reads and nobody admits if they weren't published, but they can still define it as success. But that leaves out some pretty important things. By the way, there will be copies of the slides available to you, so don't worry about any notes. Or, well, don't if you want them. You know, but when you draw success that way, it might leave out some things you might care about: leisure, family, community. These are all things that probably don't fit into the definition of if you just follow my success model, you'll be okay. The other problem is, of course, a slightly different one. Life's reality is quite different. You know, we all make choices, and we don't know what they lead to. You know, how did I get to Harvard? Well, one way to get to Harvard is you go east, turn left. But the other way is you start in a small town in Utah. I'd never heard of Harvard. I got a nice scholarship that said, where do you want it to apply? I'd never heard of Harvard. I knew that the coach from the University of Utah went to Stanford, so I applied to Stanford, figuring that was better than Harvard, or better than the Utah State University. You know, the help you got at Holiday Utah was not great. And I had no idea where that would lead to. I then came to the business school because law school is 3 years long and business school is 2 years long, and I wanted to get out of school quickly. And then Vietnam came, and I decided doctorate was better than the captaincy, particularly because my brother was a major in the Marines. So all of those things, but we all make our choices without knowledge of the consequences, and yet the consequences are what we live with. Now, success is a tough problem, for one thing, because the external measures and the internal measures aren't the same. We've all experienced great acclaim for things we weren't too proud of, and feel very proud of things that nobody in the world cares about. So that creates already cognitive dissonance. Things change. The world is very different now than it was when I was graduating from an MBA program, much less from Stanford. And so trying to be successful in the way I was is not something my kids can do, because the world is very different and the opportunities are very different. Therefore, they will have different opportunities. You change. I shouldn't say this at the Divinity School, but if you still want the same things at 82 as you wanted at 22, your name's Hugh Hefner. But for most of us, we actually have grown up a little bit and are changing what we want. You know, some of it's because we're just different. And often the road to success, which is total focus on a single objective, leads to failure. That if you focus on one objective, you leave out too many things. Now, this one is sort of an interesting one to me, and it comes from personal experience. You know, there are things I could have had, but I made different choices. I started a business that's been incredibly successful. I think the people that have the stock that I had in the business probably made around $500 million last year. Well, I could have had that $500 million, but I couldn't have had the other things that I've gotten by not doing that. But I have to say, I wince. Because I say, you know, how would life have been different if I'd made that money? And the answer, I don't think it would have been better, it just would have been different. So, you know, this is like the story of the old boyfriend. You don't want him, but you don't want anybody else to have him. And that creates a problem. And what we saw is there are different kinds of success, and the satisfactions of them are quite different. Now, when you're young, there are probably some fears in your mind. Most of you aren't as young. You know, some of us haven't grown up, but we're not young. One fear is I won't be a success, whatever that means. You don't get to Harvard by being unsuccessful at anything. In fact, our admissions department guarantees that people arrive here with great rationale of success, which means the first time they have a failure, it's a problem. The second is I'll be a success, but it won't be enough. For those of you my age, you remember the Peggy Lee song about is that all there is? And the third one is I'll be a success, but I have to sell my soul. Now, there aren't any Faustian bargains. Nobody appears in a flash of thunder and says, sell your soul and I'll give you success. You generally sell your soul on the installment plan and little things that you sell as you go along. But in fact, I think that people worry about this a lot. Now, most of the advice, one of my Jewish friends said he learned everything from the Talmud because his father wasn't educated but studied the Talmud. I think I learned everything from the Reader's Digest, which is where my mother got all her information. But she said, success is getting what you want, and happiness is wanting what you get. And I think that's a very important lesson for us all, because they are very different. There's a lot of bad advice out there. There's simple rules. You can have it, just follow my logic. Steve Covey, who comes also from Utah, writes books like that and sells millions. There's a stress on perfection and having it all. This is what I call the cosmomagazine approach. You can be Dr. Ruth in the bedroom and Emeril Lagasse in the kitchen, and you can just go through and name your person, but that really doesn't work very well. And the success models we're given in society really gloss over the flaws. You know, Donald Trump is famous or infamous. I use him in my talks because I really enjoy making fun of him. You know, Martha Stewart did really well, and then she decided that telling a little lie didn't work. She didn't realize that actually the government wanted to make an example of her. Jack Welch is doing fine. Then he met one of our editors at the Harvard Business Review, and that created some challenges. You know, Beyonce, she's clearly a success, but I really wouldn't want to be any of these people. And I can't imagine hoping that my daughter would be Beyonce. I think I'd shoot them. So there are some problems there. What we did is if I were trying to be academic, I'd say, well, we engaged in this snowball technique. I think that's the stuff they call in sociology. But what we did is we went out looking for people that were interesting. And there were people that were high achievers in multiple arenas. So a Peter Ueberroth that very successful in business, ran the Los Angeles Olympics, helped to participate in renewing the downtown LA. Very interesting person. They seemed to care about others. Their success made a difference in the world of many others. They kept on growing and going. They weren't stuck in one place. So whether it was a cleaning woman that had actually, I'm not sure she's a legal alien, but I talked to her for some length, and really interesting what she's accomplished. And then we had the president of New York Life, and we had Peter Ueberroth, and we had the creator of The Simpsons. Those are quite different career paths. And this is what was important to us, is their success reflected their own values and their uniqueness. We did about 160 interviews, something on that order. And we found people who really felt very good about themselves. They didn't say the world was perfect, and they certainly didn't. One of the hardest things was get releases because they didn't want to hold themselves up as exemplars. But we call these the hallmarks of enduring success. And what we saw in their lives was sort of interesting. They seized opportunity. They didn't, if you ask them, was this in your plan? The answer was no. Something came up, and I did it. And that led to the opening of new possibilities. They avoided decisions they later regretted, and Laura and I had lots of arguments. Can you live a life without regret? And my argument was sort of, yes, you can, and her argument was, no, you can't, and we discovered we were talking about different things. She was talking about consequences, and I was talking about process. You know, bad things happen, and I don't regret them if I think I've made honest decisions that got me to that place. But you're sort of sad, you wish things worked out slightly differently. But that doesn't mean you can regret it, because you said, I did what I did, I was honest with myself, and it worked. The other thing is they enjoyed the here and now. One of the things when we were interviewing Peter Ueberroth, some ice cream arrived. He's known for liking ice cream, and somebody sent him a big freezer full as we were interviewing, and he said, well, you know, you'll probably stay to talk to me, and the ice cream will melt. Let's have the ice cream now. And, you know, and he served it to all his audience, or all the people in the office. And it was fun, and then we went back to the interview. But he wasn't so hung up on who he was that he couldn't stop and serve the ice cream. And what we did is we asked people, tell us about successes in your life. Don't tell me why you were successful. Talk to me about success. And what we did is we then looked at these things, and they actually fell into some interesting categories, and this is what we call the landscape of satisfaction. One was achievement. That's what you do against people that are striving for other similar goals: money, power, fame, you know, athletic skill. That's a very important part of success, but isn't the only success. There are other successes like significance. What have you done for others that other people care about? And then there's happiness. You feel about pleasure in about your life. And then there's legacy. Have you done something that others will build upon? Now, when we looked at this, things fell into these buckets quite nicely, but they're not correlated. You can achieve without being happy. Obviously, I think Marilyn Monroe and Ernest Hemingway demonstrated that quite admirably. You can be significant without recognized. I mean, my grandfather was never more than a assistant postmaster in a small town. He was a Silver Beaver Scout, which is the highest award from National Scouting, and he left a legacy, which is a love of the environment. He certainly left a legacy in me, so I was on the board of the Nature Conservancy, and I've done a lot of things. So my grandfather left this legacy to me. I think he died leaving $2,000 maybe, and a bunch of books. And that was about all he left, but I think he both left a legacy and was significant. You know, can you be happy without the other things? Well, I think there are a whole bunch of kids in Aspen whose father said, I work so hard, I want you just to be happy, my children. They go to Aspen, and they find happiness. At least they find bottles and drugs and other things that make them happy. I was troubled by legacy and asked, can you have a legacy without any of the others? And then I think of Karl Marx, who actually I don't think was well recognized in his lifetime. He was a drunkard, he was mean to his family, but he certainly left a legacy. So they're uncorrelated. You can have one, you can have some combination, but there's nothing in life that guarantees you get them all. So that was sort of that was our first real surprise, that when you talk about success, it divides up into very different things, and that's important. And part of them is that because they're different. I mean, happiness is really about me and now. I would argue I'm not happy in the future, I'm not happy in the past, I'm happy now. Whereas legacy is about the future, and it's really not about me, it's about how other people recognize me. They're entirely different. When you think of achievement, it's against external goals, but I get to choose which goals I'm striving for. You know, I don't want to play basketball against Peter. I don't jump, and he's taller than I am. So I don't know whether you play basketball or not, but I can look at you and guarantee you can play it better than I can. And, you know, significance. Even Bill Gates can only give $10 per person to the world. So even Bill Gates has to choose to whom he wishes to be significant. And if he makes the right choice, he'll make a huge difference in people's lives. So these things have very different dimensionality to them. And that's maybe one reason why it's hard for one thing to cover them all. The other thing about them is they overlap. It's not clean. It's like many academic problems. I mean, I deal in entrepreneurship, and some of my colleagues hope that somebody will find a very clean look at global entrepreneurship. I point out there are 184 countries in the United Nations. There are probably 8 ethnic groups in each of those on average, and there are 99 SIC codes, and think you'll find a single statement that tells you how to operate that is probably a forlorn hope. But when we looked at it, we sort of said, you know, there's something interesting about these things. They actually have very different drivers. Achievement can be driven by some very positive things that are largely internal, recognition, pride, and mastery, or achievement can be driven out of envy and greed. You know, I know people who feel badly. One of them, a guy I know says, you know, I just haven't done very well. Bill Gates has 1,000 times as much money as I have. And you point out that $68 million is enough for most people. But as long as you compare yourself to Bill Gates, you're going to feel badly about your wealth. And, you know, I'm pretty sure they're better looking guys than I am. But I try to actually keep myself in reasonable shape, and I feel pretty good about it. But if I start comparing myself to Brad Pitt, I'm in trouble. Significance. It has some positive things that are largely external. Am I thinking about fairness, generosity, caring? Or is this about sort of power and a self-aggrandizement? None of us have ever met people in the not-for-profit world who are there for showing who they are. So there are some positive emotions, negative emotions. Even legacy. There's altruism and generative desires. I want to leave the world a better place. But I know people that write trusts that they hope will endure 1,000 years. They somehow want to control from the grave. They think that they can tell their future generations of their family how to behave. I'm always reminded of Tommy Mansville. His grandfather thought it was good to get married, so he put a provision in the will that you got $1 million when you got married. So he got married 17 times. That is a true story. It's called the incentive structures. And so trying to control from the grave is, my brother-in-law has written a 1,000-year trust. And I asked him how well William the Conqueror is doing in predicting that everything has happened because the trust still has a few years to run. So that's sort of a hopeless thing, but some people try and do it. And even happiness has some funny things to it. If you think of it about as myself and now, then contentment and fulfillment is important. But we have people who want to be happy sort of out of gluttony and laziness. I mean, the kids in Aspen, I mean, the problem is when the father goes out and says to the kids, you know, what are you doing out here? They say, well, you told me to be happy, Dad, and I'm really happy. That's not the idea he had about what led to happiness, but the kids have interpreted it in their own way. So it's complicated, and the way you achieve success in these French dimensions is pretty hard. You know, some people think if you just find your passion. I don't know how many times I want to throw up when people say, find your passion at work. Well, somehow if you can find that one thing, in that achievement, you'll find significance, happiness, and legacy. The only problem is it doesn't work. One activity rarely has it all. If you say, I'm never happier than when I'm at the office, you've probably got a problem. And if you try and find love at the office, you'll have a lawsuit. There are different constituencies with different judgments. You know, when the father comes home and says to the kids, I'm working so hard, I'm doing it all for you, my children, what are the children's thinking? It's something like, bullshit, Dad, you're doing it for yourself. You know, we'll be happy with the money you're making, but please don't, I use technical terms, so I'm apologizing, but I think that's a technical term. But, you know, there are different constituencies with different judgments, and if you don't understand that, those one way of doing it won't work. It also requires very different skills. The skills to be loving and caring are very different than the skills for high achievement. I don't know of anybody, if you watch, I shouldn't use Tiger Woods as an example, but everybody else does now. But you know, if you go out there, he's not loving and caring his opponents. He's actually going out to try and humiliate them. And that's what often happens in the achievement realm. And there are obviously different contexts. If I try and be CEO at home, the chief operating officer has something to say. So we have to have a very different relationship when we go into a different context. And sometimes just doing one thing leads to collateral damage. You know, the fact you do it something very well, that poor beaver did something very well, it just killed him. And I think there is some of that in life as well. There's another set of books out there, like From Success to Significance or Halftime, that sort of say, achieve. And once you've achieved enough, you can be significant. You can start giving your money away. And then once you're significant enough, you'll find happiness. And then I guess the theory is that when you pass beyond, you leave your legacy. That's why you write a trust, so other people will leave. The only trouble is that doesn't work either. When do you move on? What's enough for now is probably not enough for a lifetime. I've never met people that say, oh, thank God I've made all the money I ever need, now I'll get rid of it. There are some, I'm sure, and Dan knows of them and has written about them. But in fact, most people who are interested in achievement want to keep going. And you see the people who go to retire to play golf in Florida, they were achieving high before they got there, and now they want to achieve in golf. The only trouble is if you started at age 65, you're not going to be ever good. But there are continuing emotional needs that are incredibly important. Also, you can always maximize. There's a temptation to go for more. There's no matter, you know, I studied math when I was young, and I learned one thing when I went to Stanford, which is there were people that were smarter and harder working and loved math more than I did. But one thing I did learn in getting my degree in mathematics is there's always one more. And there is no stopping place if you're trying to maximize, because there's always more. And that was what Sam Gompers, the great labor leader, said, is when asked what he wanted, he said, I want more. But there's also these continuing emotional needs. You don't give up the need for achievement. You never give up the need for loving. I mean, if you have emotional needs, now it's nice if you're Donald Trump. I think he only has envy and greed as his emotional drivers. And that's easy, because that's an easy thing to satisfy. Now, he has called me a couple of times, or his office has called me to complain about things I say about him. And it's not what you think. They told me that I underestimated his wealth. And they were right. See, I was deducting the liabilities from his assets, and he has no intention of paying him back, so he's probably right. He is much more wealthy. But I think when you look at this, the other thing about it is there are missed opportunities. If you wait, you know, can you wait to be happy? I can't imagine living a life that says, I'm going to achieve, and when I've achieved enough, then I'll be happy. Or be significant. I mean, you sort of miss some opportunities. And by the way, I doubt if your family will wait. Now, in some cases, you get to start over with a second family, but I think having a 5-year-old at my age is the first wife's revenge. And I don't have a 5-year-old. I tell my wife I'm so glad I married her, not her daughters. They're very cute, but man. What we observed was a pattern in the people we talked to that was quite different. What we saw is people that said, look, there's some of these things, achievement, significance, and happiness. And we started on a small stage. So their stories that they told us often started when they're young about all of the three things: achievement, significance, happiness. And they said, look, we started small, I did some things, and then I got onto a bigger circle and a bigger circle. And by the way, they told us of legacies that they spun out as they went along. Some of them happened when they're very young. And the problem with the other is you don't know when it's going to end. I died 3 years ago, literally. I flatlined. I happened to do it walking across campus at Harvard Business School on a sunny day in January, and it was really good. They came up and somebody gave me CPR, and 90 seconds later they came out with a defibrillator, and 45 minutes later they got me stable enough to get me to the hospital. But you don't know. So if you wait till the end, you're probably going to wait a little too long for any of these things. There's another problem, which is it's easy to put activities in the wrong domain. That you put your children in achievement. Those of you who live in Cambridge all know Shady Hill. Excuse me. I shouldn't say things like that, but I find it amusing. Business activities as happiness. Yeah, probably not right. Children's trusts as legacy. Clearly a little foolish to think that your legacy is what you tell your kid, even if you leave the ethical will, which some people say, oh, I'm going to tell my kids what to do when I die. As my mother used to say, your actions speak so loudly I cannot hear a word you say. So don't wait to write your ethical will. Visible leadership of charities is significance. So these are all sort of putting them in the wrong place. And one of the questions I always ask my friends is, where do you put your tennis? If at my age, I still play tennis, not very well, but I played with the same group. Well, I played on the same court for about 28 years. Now, I can't put tennis in my achievement category, but I can put it in my happiness and my significance category. I'm playing with friends, and we go out there and we play very hard, but nobody remembers who won the most games. And the important thing is that we have a pretty even match, and we're also inconsistent. It always is even. Now, one of the things is that when you think about the four domains, our observation is most normally well-adjusted people have all the emotions we talk about, and they want significance in satisfaction in all these domains. Seeking one hinders the pursuit of others. If you're totally focused on achievement, it's really hard to be significant. On the other hand, if you're totally focused on significance, it's really hard to be a high achiever. So the time you spend doing one thing is probably taken away from doing the other things. And I believe, and I can't prove this, but great satisfaction in one area can't make up for the disappointment you have from missing the others. So, and yet we talk about balance, but I don't think it's about balance. Because balance is a very static thing. It implies we can make trade-offs that are stable over time. It's the problem with utility theory in economics. It's a conformal mapping onto an array of a complex multi-dimensional space. It doesn't work. I would argue it's actually a much more difficult problem. It's about juggling. And juggling is a very different thing than balancing. If you think about juggling, the first thing is you got to keep your eye on all the balls. No matter what balls you have, you got to keep your eye on all of them. If you focus on one, you're guaranteed to drop the others. The secondly is when you touch something, you have to give it energy. Because at the process of juggling, you got to give it energy, because if you don't throw it high enough, you won't be able to have enough time to catch the other ones. You got to release it. You got to let something go. You give it energy, then you release it. And you have to know what you're doing with it. You have to throw it thoughtfully and carefully. You go to the Cirque du Soleil and see them throw those balls. It's really quite amazing. And you have to practice. But one of the things about juggling is you got to catch the falling ball. The most important ball is the ball that's falling. And I think one of the things you see in success in life is people understand that if they want all four, any ball they're losing track of is a problem. Now, some of the balls may be made out of glass. I would argue that the family is sort of a glass ball. If you drop it, it may shatter. The career ball may be more rubber-like, and happiness certainly is. You can have a period when you're not very happy, but you'd better say, what's wrong with me that I'm not enjoying life? Now, part of the problem is as we go through life, in your early career, you don't think a lot about legacy. That isn't a big ball. It may be there and you may spin some things out, but you probably don't even think that you created a legacy. Significance when you're young is probably highly focused. At least I found that with my kids, at least for a long time. They were focused on one person, and that was much more important than the other people in life. Happiness, kids are pretty good at that, but there is a big red ball called achievement, and society says achieve, achieve, achieve. I always tell my students at the business school that McKinsey doesn't give you a $150,000 a year job. They give you a $60,000 a year job with 50 hours a week of mandatory overtime at time and a half. So just understand the deal you're getting and don't think they're paying you too much. You really have a lousy job. It's just a lot of overtime. You know, when you get mid-career, what I'd argue is you know who your significant, you know what makes you happy, and you pretty much know how what you're good at and how you're going to achieve. And then legacy starts rearing its head. You know, so when you get to Dan's age, you start to say, what do people remember me for? You don't get to determine, I'm sorry, Bill Clinton, but you get to think about it. He left us a lot of good jokes, or some bad jokes. So when you get to my age, achievement's pretty well behind you. And Don was kind enough to mention I've written a lot of books. Many of them are the character that if you put them down, you can't pick them up. There are a lot of articles that nobody ever misses if I didn't write them. And you know, there's some other things I've done that I'm pretty proud of. Some of them have to do with the fundraising and some of the institutes we've created. So there are things you sort of say, well, I'm not going to do 60 times as much in the next 5 years of my life. So my achievement's pretty well behind me. I have a lot of significant people to me because over life, you know, what they say, well, they actually say it wrong. They say friends come and go, but enemies accumulate. But in fact, when you think about it, you know, by the time you're my age, I have 7 kids. 5 of them are married. There were 7 last year that were married, but 5 were married this year. We have 11 grandchildren. My brother was 4 of his 5 ex-wives came to make sure the son of a bitch was dead when we had his funeral. So I was left with my nieces and nephews to deal with. And so, you know, you start accumulating all these things and, you know, aunts and uncles and then the uncle. And, you know, you wind up with a whole bunch of people to whom you have to be significant. You know, maybe you've left a legacy, maybe you haven't, but it's pretty well determined. And then you got to think, what's life been like? And the nice thing is when I awakened in the hospital, you know, my wife was standing there and I've been out for 3 days and she said, do you know where you are? And I looked around and said, yes, I'm in a hospital. And she said, do you know why you're here? And I said, I presume something serious happened. And she told me, you know, my first thought is it's nice to be here. And the second was, well, what if it had been the end? And the answer was, well, it was a good life. You know, I really had no regrets. You know, I had some more things I wanted to do, but, you know, I was walking across campus with a friend, so it was pretty good. You know, if that's the way you have to go, and I wouldn't have had to clean out my office that way, so that was really good. You go back to the key problems, which are where we started. You can't have it all. Things change, you change. It hurts when others experience a success that could have been yours. Now, if our first surprise was the complexity of success, and our second surprise was the emotional drivers, the third was the role of enough. And that really was a shock because, you know, other than McKibben's book on enough, I don't see the title enough in many books. And yet enough is a very interesting English word. It has a minimum, have you done enough? And it has a maximum, you've done enough. So it's a very interesting sort of etymology to it that I think we probably ought to talk more about because the maximizing, which is what the language of the economists give us, I think is actually pernicious. Now, enough is sort of critical to implementing a life, a sense of enough. And I want to spend my last 5 minutes telling you why. You know, it's enough on 2 counts. One is the dimensions. You got to get the 4 dimensions right, but you also have to have their subparts. You can't be a general purpose achiever. You know, is my achievement going to be on writing academic journals or writing books that people read? Is it going to be about making money, or is it going to be playing fantasy baseball? I mean, there are a lot of things that we get to choose, and we get to choose how we're going to do it. To whom do I wish to be significant? What makes me happy? If you don't know what makes you happy, you're probably not going to be happy. So you got to figure out what makes you happy, and do more of it. And the things that make you unhappy, do less of it. That's what faculty meetings are about. There's also an issue of time that what's enough for today is not enough for this week, is not enough for this year, and certainly isn't enough for a lifetime. But if you can set those standards of enough, you actually free yourself up. Why? Well, one thing is a sense of enough says, I've made progress. And none of you are achievers, I know, right? None of you are competitive at all. You're all relaxed, want other people to succeed, and never want any recognition. Oh, I'm at a divinity school. That may be true, but it certainly isn't school at my place. And I won't ask Bill whether it's true here. As dean, he probably hears a few things that aren't necessarily publicized. It's the fun part about being a dean. But one of the things about enough is you can say, I've done enough. You can put something down with satisfaction. Think of the role of understanding that I've done enough work for today. What does that mean to you? It means I can stop. It means I can say I've done something that was important because I crossed that off my goal. It doesn't mean I've done all the work I need to do in my life, but if I can define what's enough work for today, I feel that way about food. If I can say I've had enough food, I probably won't gain weight. That's a skill I haven't developed yet. But one of the things that enough does is helps you see different and new benefits from the next activity. If you can say, look, I've done enough of this, what can I get out of that? It actually helps you make the transitions. And yet, with a sense of enough that's time-dated, saying, I've done enough for today, but I haven't done enough for this week, it gives you reasons to come back and do things. So the goal-setting process is actually very critical in many, many ways. And what we see is, first, what are your value systems? One of my wife's round number birthdays, one of the daughters said, mirror, mirror on the wall, I'm like my mother after all, which came as a shock to her. But in fact, when you think about enough, it comes out of deeply held values. You don't know where they come from necessarily, although I suspect many of us got those values from our parents. What's enough money? What's enough work? What's enough recognition? Do I want to be front and center, or am I willing to have other people get the credit? There are a lot of things. The second thing is it sets limits, and those limits, in fact, allow transitions. And I think the most important thing about enough is it both motivates and rewards. If you've decided in your mind what's enough, you're motivated to accomplish it, and then you're rewarded when you achieve it. So the third surprise is really setting limits increase the dimensionality of our lives and of success. So I'll end with two sort of thoughts. One of the things I'd say to my students is, what do you want your satisfactions to be in those domains? It's not a lifetime commitment, but not addressing it means you might wind up on the train to Amarillo. If you say, I'm really going to go out and just make money, well, I can almost guarantee you won't have a good family life. Your family may have a good life, but you won't have a good family life. What does your profile look like now? Because I think most of our students are high achievers, but they may have left off some of the things that they'll later regret. Are you on your way to your ideal, and are you satisfied with the way your success reflects your core drivers? Now, the core drivers are things like values, emotions, the context in which you're raised. Those are all very core to us. I suspect if we wrote those down, they'd be quite different in this group. But they're also very, very hard to change and very important in evaluating our own success. And then the last question here is, are your emotional drivers positive? If you remember on that slide on emotional drivers, there's negative and positive drivers. Now, I would argue that many people don't understand when they're being driven by envy and greed. And if you ask them about it, they'd say, no, no, no. But in fact, it's quite evident they are. And things like achievement, you have to choose your own goals. You have to choose your own comparators. And by choosing those, you actually help yourself make good decisions. So being a teacher, and I'll end on this slide, I'm going to give you a take-home exam. Because the question is, who are you? What are your core drivers? What are the things that you care about deeply? And if it's only one or two things, I predict you'll find unhappiness later. We are complex animals. You know, my observation is many of our more successful people are very, very complex. And figuring out what you care about, what really is important to you, is incredibly important. The second question is, which satisfactions, if any, are on your way to missing? If you sit down and are honest with yourself and saying, I'm doing fine on the achievement, but I'm not doing so well on the happiness side, you know, my only advice to my kids is marry a happy person, because it's really hard to make somebody who's not a happy person happy. So, but figure out what makes you happy. I know what makes me happy. I love lunches with friends. That's probably one of my great pleasures in life. So if I'm not doing it, I miss it. Who's important to you and you helping them to succeed? This is not about the economic model of man as self-interested with guile. I think when you think about this model of success, you can't succeed unless you help others to succeed. Who do you want to help to succeed? Maybe you can help all the world. I was at a session Friday of the visiting committee at the business school, and somebody wanted us to help. I think I worked it out. We needed to help 30 million people persons per faculty member. And I was thinking, that's really a hard job. And I raised the question whether they really expected us to be that effective. That wasn't very popular, but I raised the question anyway. And, you know, the question is, what's your time frame for action? And, of course, the time for taking this test is the rest of your life. So I'm now going to turn it over to Dan, and I think he'll kill the slide.
Thanks, Howard, and thanks to all of you for coming out. It's really fun to be part of this experiment in conversation across boundaries, and I hope that it will be the first of many. Thanks also to Don and Peter and Candace and Tim and everyone that kind of came together in thinking this through and envisioning what a conversation could be like. I'm going to make three fairly unrelated points in response to Howard's comments. First has to do with Dorothy Day, who is probably a more familiar character in this community than over at the business school, though I'm happy to say that about a third of our attendees there were familiar with her work as probably the most influential Roman Catholic pacifist of the 20th century. Dorothy Day held fast to her anti-war commitments in the face of World War II, mentored many of the most important anti-Vietnam War peace activists, and also built what's now a 200 community network of urban households and rural villages in which people share all aspects of their lives with the poor. You might think that Dorothy Day would not have much in common with the successful corporate executives and high achievers on whom Howard based his study. Yet as I read his book, I repeatedly thought of her life story. In particular, I thought of her decision in September 1943, at the height of World War II, to take a step away from her role as community founder, as peace activist, to devote a year to prayer, reflection, and spending time with her teenage daughter. It was a risky decision. At that moment, the movement she had worked so hard to build was at real risk of collapse. Many young volunteers were heading off to enlist in the military. Those who, on principle, were unwilling to do that were often going into conscientious objector work camps. By stepping away, she risked the loss of all that she had labored to build up, but she realized that her achievement as a movement founder was not all there was to her life, and that perhaps her single-minded focus had become as unhealthy as that of the young entrepreneur who hopes to earn her first billion by age 30. During the sabbatical, Day pursued significance through deeper practices of prayer, happiness through more time with her daughter, and a legacy by corresponding with the young men who had gone off to war, the men who had rejected her own pacifism. That correspondence prepared her to be a good mentor to the hundreds of intensely one-dimensional activists who passed through her movement in subsequent decades. She challenged those folks to greater radicalism, but she also challenged them to juggle their activism with family responsibilities, with prayer, and never to assume that saving the world depended on their individual efforts. So Howard's point that juggling diverse goals is important to a full life applies as much to divinity school types as to business school types. I suspect that many of us here at the Divinity School, though, will react to Howard's model by insisting that responsibility for integrating achievement, happiness, significance, and legacy rests as much with communities as it does with individuals. Howard's given us a very good model for how each of us as an individual might approach this balance. But the question we would typically ask here is, how can religious communities promote the sort of conversations and reflection that Howard described? My own experience is that most local congregations don't do this very well. There's a lot of conversations about things that fall into that significance box, values, volunteering, but fewer conversations about how to fit that with happiness and achievement and legacy. In many congregations, serious conversations about money are limited to the annual pledge drive, when people think about how much of their money to give to the congregation, but don't dig into the bigger picture of how to balance all the different spending priorities in life, or to balance the time spent earning money with time spent doing other things. And yet there's a rich religious pedigree for just the sort of thing that Howard is doing. And I meant to say at the beginning that one big learning of this is that business school professors can also preach. If local congregations don't spend enough time thinking about just enough, monastic communities and religious orders have been doing it for more than 2,000 years. The medieval idea of the 7 deadly sins, for example, was rooted in monastic traditions that identified multiple dimensions to human personality, each of which needed to be honored, and each of which could become distorted if not placed in lively interaction with the others. I hope some of you noticed Howard's debt to these traditions in the way that terms like gluttony, pride, envy kept cropping up as the shadow sides of the values he was promoting. In the Egyptian desert 1,500 years ago, monks were drawing maps of human development quite similar to the diagrams Howard just shared, and I suspect some of you in Buddhist and Hindu studies could give examples of people doing the same thing in India a millennium before that. From my perspective, monastic communities have been able to promote this kind of reflection for 2 reasons. First, they typically have some notion of human sainthood, of the possibility that people can grow towards wholeness. From their perspective, it's not enough simply to follow a set of rules, don't do this. One can actually move towards a richer and more integrated life as one moves forward. Second, members of monastic communities typically share their whole lives with one another: work, play, rest, worship. So they're positioned to hold one another accountable to the work of juggling in a way that our more segmented society can make very challenging. So I think that both local congregations and business enterprises can learn a lot about the disciplines of juggling from monastic communities. That suggestion may not be too controversial. I'd like to make a corollary that undoubtedly will provoke much more debate, and I'm not quite sure of this myself. The juggling approach to the diverse dimensions of human flourishing that I see in the monastic tradition at its best is often at odds with a strand of theology that might be called radical monotheism, a tradition that assumes there's one ultimate value that trumps all others. If you think about it, Howard is promoting a kind of polytheism when he argues that happiness, achievement, and significance and legacy are all important and not reducible to one another. As such, his vision resonates both with religious traditions that are explicitly polytheistic and with the soft polytheism, if you will, of traditions that place a strong emphasis on the communion of saints, on the mediation of angels, things like that. But it's at odds with traditions such as Calvinism that are critical of mediation and stress kind of the direct encounter between the individual and God. I'm one of those who still believes that Max Weber was mostly correct in arguing that Calvinism created the context in which early capitalists devoted themselves single-mindedly to the accumulation of capital. And I think that we may have to make a basic choice between that sort of single-minded spirituality and the juggling approach that Howard is recommending. Finally, my third point, I'd like to turn the conversation back to the set of concerns that got this going in the first place. A year and a half ago, Don Swear started thinking about ecologies of human flourishing and practices of enoughness at the Divinity School Convocation. He was very much focused on environmental concerns. How do we cultivate a sense of enoughness that will replace the philosophies of endless growth that have led to global warming and a host of other problems? Personally, I'm convinced that this is shared work for everybody on the planet today. The current economic crisis is an opportunity for us to think more deeply about ecological practices of enoughness. At the same time, I worry that certain approaches to the climate crisis fall into the same single measure style of thinking that Howard is warning us against. A few weeks ago, Bill McKibben spoke here about the 350 movement, a campaign to demand policies that will reduce atmospheric carbon to 350 parts per million. I think that approach is politically brilliant because it gives a clear, sharp focus. But spiritually, it does make me a little worried. So I'd like to reflect on how Howard's multifaceted paradigm might fit with environmental concerns. The temptation is to put the environment just in the box of significance, perhaps, or legacy. And anything that we do to help the environment fits into that part of the grid. I'd like to suggest instead that a full response to the environmental crisis requires action, not necessarily by everyone at every moment, in all four of Howard's dimensions. Entrepreneurial achievers can promote new technologies that are certainly needed in solar and wind and so forth. Religious achievers can promote practices of intense self-discipline, going totally local in our food choices. In our pursuit of happiness, we can find tasty food and deeper friendships with other people by going to local farmers markets. And that's also a key part of the puzzle. Though in some ways environmental work is significant in and of itself, there's a danger that we won't grasp its significance if we're successful and we avoid all the horrible things that might otherwise happen. So it's important, I think, to stress environmental strategies that have other sorts of significance, creating green jobs in this country or using solar energy in Africa as a strategy for the economic development of impoverished villages. Finally, the question of the environment is a huge question of legacy, and my hope would be that if we address the immediate concerns, with a spirit of juggling, we will develop the kind of versatility that will help other generations address the next climate crisis that comes after global warming. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Candace?
Listening to Howard and Dan, we see, Howard is sort of a representative from that place across the river, right? That place that represents the other world, the world of business and capitalism. And Dan represents some of the finest of what's here, the kind of thought process here. I'm like the official schizophrenic on this panel. I could say it nicely and say, I drink from, I have always, my whole life been drinking from both springs, but I think sometimes it maybe looks like careening from one to the other. For example, I spent 7 years of my life living with what was on my back. Everything I owned literally was on my back. I was paid about $250 a month. I had no constant home, and I shopped out of Salvation Army. And I spent another chapter of my life that was probably epitomized by standing on the trading floor of Goldman Sachs as my stock, as it became an IPO, ticked across the ticker, and I became briefly worth over $100 million in one day. So I have sort of experienced these extremes, and I used to feel a little self-conscious about it. But I now find for myself that it's when these language systems or symbol systems clash that, for me, the questions become really interesting. And it's the only place I think we could ever find the answers is where they clash. And so I really like living in that place now. And I've gotten used to being provoked and uncomfortable a lot of the time about this. So it seems to me that I think the first time that this hit me, this clash of symbols, this clash of worlds really hit me in a deep way. It's a very odd place to have an epiphany. But I was in Versace in the Fifth Avenue store in New York, and it was about 2 weeks after my IPO, and I was suddenly, as I said, momentarily very wealthy. And I think everyone in the world should, it's like a reality show. If you could be wealthy for 6 months, the world can be an okay place, because I actually got to taste not only what's enough, but what is way, 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 way too much. But it's hard to taste it until you get something so ludicrous. So I went to Versace, and literally the doorman saw me coming because he reads the Post and knows who's having IPOs in New York. So he greets me, "Hello, Miss Carpenter. Nice to hear about your IPO." And I'm like, "Oh God, this is okay." So I walk in, and they're waiting for me. Of course, I'm fresh prey. So they basically show me these beautiful dresses, including one that was the most beautiful dress, probably one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, all hand sewn, very gorgeous. And I said, "Oh, I'll take it." And it was the moment when I realized for the first time that I could own pretty much anything on earth that I wanted. I'd never really thought of it that way. I didn't build the company for that reason. I built it because I was really excited about social networks, but there I was. And I said, "Oh, great, I like that one. Pack that one up." And as they were packing it, I said very incidentally, "By the way, how much was that?" And they said it was $50,000. And I really, oh my God, I still remember this feeling so profoundly, thinking, wow, I have, and our culture has this whole question is upon us now, because we can have anything. What's enough? And what's appropriate? And when is that choice a moral choice? And not that I'm going to take a lot of credit for this, but I did tell them, unpack the dress. Like that, it's like I felt like I stepped back from the ledge and began to reflect on this question. And I reflected so hard that I ended up at Union Theological Seminary, which, as you guys know, is very much about social justice and was very life-changing for me. I got in so many arguments with all the professors. Many of them became, like James Cone, really close friends of mine, because when you argue that much with anyone, you have to become friends at the end. And I guess I saw there, I had a question about this. If we're trying to understand what's enough, do we decide it by, the world is a pie, right? And there's, we have a piece, someone else has a piece, and I think more in terms of societies maybe than individuals at this point in terms of this question. So if our culture gobbles up way more than our share and then there's not much left of the pie for everyone else, is that how we would decide it? In other words, if I took that dress, am I taking food out of the mouths of children somewhere across the world? The other way, the problem with that is every society that's really tried for radical equality, has never lasted very long, because there's gluttony, greed, passion, aggression, ignorance in the Buddhist language, and the 7 deadly sins in the Christian language, and problems with the way we as humans seem to operate that seem to doom that. And I think it's doomed for another reason as well that I'll talk about later. But the other question is it just subjective? So in other words, the day I didn't buy the $50,000 dress, I bought a $5,000 dress instead, and I felt very virtuous. But you have to ask yourself, sure, did I deserve to feel really virtuous? And just because I felt virtuous, did that make me so? And did that begin to solve the problem? I mean, were more kids going to eat that night because I chose that dress instead of the other dress? So this stuff really, really started bothering me, as it should bother all of us, and probably bothers you guys, and that's part of why you're here. What I think happened at seminary is I ran very much into the social justice defined as there's a pie and we have to redistribute it. I would say the time at the Union that the symbols, the language systems clashed in a way that was extremely like a world opening up for me. I guess for some people it's Zen koans. For me, it's like when these two languages just hit each other hard. And it happened, I was in Bridget Call's class on Paul and Empire, really a very life-changing class for me that led to many more years of questioning this issue. And I was wearing a cross like many, many people at Union. There are people at Union, as here, of many different faiths, but it's very typical to wear a cross to class. The issue is about halfway through the class, as we're thinking very deeply about the oppression of the Romans and the economic oppression and the impact this had on the early Jesus movement and what Jesus was trying to say about this, I realized that my cross, this symbol of saying no to empire, my cross had come out of a little blue box and was made of diamonds. And I was like, whoa. And I kind of, did one of these. And but it had a deep effect on me because, again, I had to ask, clearly in our society, I would say these are two of the most important symbols there are, and what do they mean when you put them together? And probably nothing good is what I decided, and I actually quit wearing that piece of jewelry because I came to understand the cross in a very different way at Union. Not as a sign of helplessness, but as a sign of tremendous power and tremendous thoughts about this idea of enoughness. However, I think that the social justice frame never did quite do it for me in the way it was being described, for the same reason that liberation theologians like James Cone gets in so much trouble with womanist theologians, because no matter if you divide the pie to make room for one more group, then who else are you still leaving out? It's kind of it just seems to me like a little bit of an empty set issue. You can never really get there this way if the pie is always the same. What really began to interest me is this, that it's not so much capitalism and religion. It's very much more this idea of acquisitive capitalism, scorekeeping capitalism, bragging rights capitalism, a lot of what we see on Wall Street, taking a piece out of something that someone else created so that you can brag about it, and acquisitive religion. It only takes one visit to the Vatican, right, to see acquisitive religion in action. And no disrespect meant to Catholicism, but I was overwhelmed when I visited the Vatican. I was speechless with it, really. So much wealth, so much art in that building under guard. I just was like, wow, what is this? And I think, we can look at, I had a spiritual teacher, a Buddhist spiritual teacher, who raised the same issue in just purely spiritual terms, spiritual materialism. And I experienced it a little. I did a month-long Datun, of sitting every day. And by the end, I had to ask the same question about that. What is enough? And why were we all there exactly? And, to some degree, were we racking up points or proving something or operating in the achievement mode? What was that about? Why not meditate, an hour every day for the rest of your life? So anyway, that actually provoked me as well. The Datun really provoked me to see how in the religious realm, the spiritual realm, this same question came up. And Rinpoche clearly identified this when he brought Tibetan Buddhism to America. And for him, the symbol systems clashed as well in a very powerful way. But I put that against this idea of generative capitalism, generative spirituality, of whom I think the people you're talking about are such great representatives. Generative capitalism to me is a capitalism that created microloans, that creates clean tech, that created hybrid cars, that is creating the world in a way, is creating the world for us. Not the capitalism that creates the 301st cereal choice. After I saw the Hurt Locker and that scene in which he's detonated 893 bombs, and he's about to leave his child and miss his child's growing up to go back and detonate more, theoretically, in his mind, to save the children that would be killed by those bombs. And he's on leave, and he's in the grocery store, and he's facing this cereal row. And I mean, that's how I feel when I face the cereal row. It's completely overwhelming existentially. But there's a kind of capitalism that creates that 301st brand. Why? Because the pie is shelf space and they want more of it. But there's a capitalism that creates a new way of thinking about the world. Microloans to me remain the best single example, how to empower the world at a different level. And in fact, I think without this kind of generative energy, and new religious movements to me come out of this, and Weber wrote about, lots of people have written about it, but this generative energy that is really coming from creating something different, transforming the world, not cutting it up and dividing it. And I don't see how we are ever going to get to a kingdom of God on earth from simply dividing and redividing and redividing and redividing the pie, as opposed to a kind of not creative, but creation energy that remakes the world, that rethinks the world, that innovates completely new things in the world. And very interestingly enough, I'll just say from my iVillage experience at creating an internet company, the first few of us that started this, and Jeff Bezos was one of them, freshly minted entrepreneur, and in the first year when we were all working, all of us really just wanted to create. To be very honest, the last thing on our minds is that we were going to make a dime out of this. I was a single mother who really should have had a job when you get right down to it, and been supporting my family in a proper way. And many of us simply, I don't know, it's like this invention just poured through us in the way that people are called to religious service. It was a kind of just being driven to connect people in the world in a way the internet made possible. Interestingly enough, the next generation were totally in the acquisitive camp. They could see that we were popular in the press, going to make money. Now they were really interested, and they piled on. And this happens in every movement and in whether it's religious or capitalist. And this, as I've been studying the history of religion, I've been completely fascinated. It's the same story over and over again in both realms. So what I feel, and I'm just one person on this journey, but really, really interested in this question all the time, and so grateful that Don, provoked my husband and I with his convocation last fall, 2 years ago, right? Wow, that many of you were probably at, where he talked about enoughness in a very striking way. And, I think for me it clarifies the following, that the question for me isn't, really, should I give half of everything I have right this second? Should I distribute it into, billions of bits and send a little piece of it to other people on the planet? It's, if I spend time consuming, I'm not creating. Those two things don't really occur in the same space. So if I spend time consuming more than really I need to function in the role of creating, that is how I understand that I have too much. And I get in that space. When I buy the 100th pair of shoes, I am clearly, Buddhists talk about the human precious life. And I ask myself the question now, not, is that too many shoes? Because for a woman, that is an impossible philosophical impasse that can never be answered until the pearly gates open. But I can ask myself, is this time, this hour and a half that I'm spending, and this $150 or $1,000, whatever it is I'm spending on this 101st pair of shoes, what impact does it have on myself and my human precious life, generating the kind of world that I want to see us all have. And that's now been very helpful to me in terms of, okay, I need to get sleep. Why do I need to get sleep? Well, if I get too much sleep, then that takes away from my being generative. But if I get too little, that takes away from being generative. So really, it keeps me, all religious traditions try to keep us on that middle ground, where we basically, but now I guess for myself, I understand why the middle ground makes so much sense. I understand that it's in that middle place where we're healthy, but not pampered. We're not at the spa every day, but we're healthy and we have enough sleep and we have enough money, we have enough food to eat, but we're not spending all our time consuming that. We have the possibility of really, really, really being generative people on this planet. And that's what's become important to me. I want to say that in two things. One, that I was probably most influenced since I came back here to Harvard and just started taking some more courses and working with some professors, that I think the ideas that have been the most potent for me have been really the ideas of the postmodernists, Derrida and Crowd, and I know there's a lot of interest in them here. And I think the reason is that when he talks about radical hospitality to the stranger, what I love about that is it's not, as I understand it, it's not about dividing the pie. It is a lot more demanding than dividing the pie, what's being spoken about. What's being spoken about is that our obligation runs so deep to create the world in a way that's hospitable to the stranger. We don't even know what's going to be asked of us until it's asked. And that's a lot more threatening than just, I'll tithe, I'll give away everything I own. Because maybe you don't want what I own. Maybe you need something deeper from me. And that's threatening and fabulous. And to me, the way religion and spirituality should always be operating. If they're not threatening me, they're not happening. And that's why I think generative capitalism is completely threatening. When you're operating in generative capitalism, you're putting everything on the line. You have no idea what's going to happen. There's no security. There's usually no prestige because what you're doing is so little. No one really gives a rat's ass, to use another technical term. So I don't know. I guess I just want to say that I find that I'm very hopeful that that particular way of viewing the world and our calling will grow and reach more popular circles, because I believe that it has potential to bring these symbol sets together in an interesting way. And I just want to finish on one thing that Don asked me to talk about, which is just how we see this generative capitalism idea, this idea of generativeness operating in business. Practices and in governance and things like that. And, I've done a lot of work in governance, and I've been really interested in it, probably because it relates to this issue, how a company is run and what its value systems are, how people are compensated. All of this really runs to this issue. But I think it's very hard. It's very hard to know when somebody will come to the conclusion that they want to cross over from being acquisitive to being generative. And I think it's very hard to legislate, and I wish we could. I'm so angry at those people on Wall Street that did what they just did with these bonuses. I am so angry at them. Not the least of which is a lot of people think capitalism is capitalism, and it gives one of the most powerful forces on earth to recreate the world in a positive way a bad name. It really pisses me off. However, I don't think you could talk those people right now into a generative capitalism. And I don't think you could legislate them into a generative capitalism, any more than we can legislate the Pope, into a different form of what he's up to. So it just seems to me that, the only thing that we can do, I really believe, is every single one of us take a life of generation as a way, as a message of attraction. It's a way of putting your life in the place that you wish other people could put it, and speak with actions rather than words. And every time we turn down a prestigious appointment that really wasn't coming from a generative place, or we go to get another credential, or we go for money instead of going for what we know in our hearts is the place we belong at the moment, I believe that stand permeates to so many people. My husband just took a 97% pay cut to go teach at the business school. He has so much wisdom to share with these young kids who can shape the world and want to shape the world a lot more than their reputation, suggests. Now, before that, he was making a lot of money So to me, those are not really morally different situations. It's just when the call came, he answered it in the right, he answered it, he responded. He did something many of his friends thought was like totally insane. Have you guys ever done that? When your friends all think you're crazy, you are probably on the right track. And going to Harvard, and I've been to Harvard, Stanford, and Columbia, so please don't think this is not me like on a high horse, but I know that many of the worst decisions I've made have been collecting, degrees, labels, prestige, etc. And many of the best decisions I've made have been very lonely. And those have turned out to be so generative. It doesn't mean I've used everything I learned at the business school, everything I learned at Columbia, and those, in the context of a full life, they've really meant a lot. But I have to be very careful, when I have a choice like that looks good to other people. Those are the choices I think we have to really question whether they are truly generative in where they're coming from in our place on the planet. So anyway, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Candace. Candace, I wonder if you and Dan and Howard would come up front. I wonder if among the panelists, if you have any comments you would like to make to the other remarks that were made by your colleagues. We'll give you an opportunity first to Q&A.
I'd like to say a few things about generative capitalism. I think this is a really exciting model and something that I hope we'll have time for much further conversation about. Basically, I have three questions about the model that you're putting forward. The first would be, how do we avoid that kind of very rapid turnover that you described, that the first generation of internet entrepreneurs were generative, the second wave were just trying to get in on the game? You talked a lot about microloans, and that's happening with microloans right now. If you look at a lot of the literature that's coming out, especially in Bangladesh, where it all started, there are villages where villages are just being piled on by one microloan officer after another. So it's very important to know when to move on to the next level of generativity. The second question would be, how do we achieve that ever-expansive generativity in our activity while relating to a steady-state universe of physical stuff? We can only be generative with the carbon and the silicon and all the different stuff of this planet in the amount that we now have. And third, since generative people tend to create rapidly growing institutions, how can we make sure that those institutions are ones that allow everybody who's part of them, and not just the original entrepreneur, to manifest their own generativity?
Well, teaching entrepreneurship, we avoid, as much as I ever can, talking about the purpose of business to maximize shareholder wealth. I've never had an employee get up in the morning and say, how do I make Howard wealthy? I've never had a customer say, how do I make Howard wealthy? I've never had a supplier say. So the people that I know that have done incredibly well, who I actually like to work with, say I serve my customers at a profit. Profit is a constraint, not a goal. And the profit includes things like, are we recognizing the full cost of our use of resources? Are we adequately accounting for depreciation in our environment? Are we doing these kind of things? So, and there are many people that have been incredibly successful, not by maximizing their shareholder wealth, but by saying, if I can serve a large group of customers with the constraint of profit. But by the way, that's true in all the not-for-profits. As mentioned, I chair National Public Radio. And we're not-for-profit. But if we don't make a surplus, we die. So, as one of my Catholic friends who ran a church hospital said, no margin, no mission. And so profit is a constraint. Everybody has to end the year with a surplus. I think even at Harvard, we probably have to figure that out. So that's the first thing, is set your goals right, not setting some theme that some economist told you. I think the second thing is we do have to have more full recognition of the costs. And it's the reason that if I were 40 years younger, I'd probably move to Brazil, because I do think that's a country that is like the United States in 1890, but they are actually doing a better job of recognizing, and some could argue about the forest, but in fact, there's a great deal of effort being put in at the government level, at the scientific level, and at the NGO level to try and say, how do we preserve the water resources, the forest resources, and actually not destroy the planet? Because if we destroy the lungs of the world, which is the rainforest in the Brazil, we're already destroying it in the Congo, but Brazil was the last good chance.
I just tackling your second question, which, because I know that's one very close to Don's heart, and for all of us, actually, in terms of real physical constraints. You know, I really believe that, you know, this is what is said. You know, I look at the business school where when I graduated, and I see the kids coming in, and they are so talented, and they are really quite spectacular, and all of you are the same. But at the business school, which I'm a little closer to, what I see is at least half the kids going out are really, really torn about where to put their energies and where to spend this precious human life, and whether they should follow the pack and be worried about legislating things like even carbon footprint, or whether they should just go on that lonely path of finding really inventive ways to, within the constraints of the planet, find sustainability. And I believe the human mind, the human spirit can find many, many solutions. If all the brain power that went into those 300 kinds of cereal went into trying to find, you know, a different way to relate to the physical constraints of the planet, I have no doubt that we'd already be there. At the end, that's why I think it boils down not even to governance or systems, but really to the choices that each person makes of which set of values they're going to pursue.
We have time for a few questions, I think. Yes, please.
I just want to ask this question. Anybody can answer this. It's about ethics and capitalism. I'll give you a personal example. A few years back, I invented the first product for the detection of multiple sclerosis for a multinational corporation. And it cost $4 for that particular kit. So, you know, I invented. So I had a meeting with the head of the marketing and the president of the company, and they wanted to introduce to the market, and they were trying to figure out how to introduce to the market. And the marketing people were asking the president, how should we, you know, price it? And the president of the company says, whatever the market bears. The head of the marketing says, okay, we'll charge $400. And I was in the back, sitting in the back. I couldn't say nothing. Okay, and it to me, it sounded very outrageous and unethical. To this day, I don't know if it was ethical or not ethical. Do you have any comments from the business school people?
First, it's stupid to price it that way, because in fact it leaves such an umbrella for competition that it will soon incentivize, you know, anything that has a 99% margin will incentivize competition. And once you demonstrate the presence of a large market, which that would do, you probably are better off not to think of it that way. Secondly, it probably lessens the size of the market because of the reimbursement. I mean, I could give a 10-minute speech on why that's a stupid way of thinking, not an unethical way of thinking. It may be unethical too, but you start with stupid. I think the second issue is the notion that so many people have of maximizing their take. Turns out, if I look at the people I've worked with over the years who've been very successful, that's not their first question. It's often the first question of a middle-level executive, but it's not the question of the real successful entrepreneur, because the first question they have is, how can I make more people want this, and how can I make sure that it's affordable, and how can I make sure I manage it at a profit? But the exploitive nature of that is just, as I say, I start with stupid, not unethical, and I think that the evidence is on my side.
Are there other, yes, over here? Is the microphone on?
Ms. Carpenter, your idea of generative capitalism is extremely exciting to me. I would compare it, though, to the monotheism that McCannon brought up. Both of them, I think, could lead to balance. Professor McCannon's through the juggling of multiple factors. Your sort of model through a single goal that leads to balance and demands balance. I'm wondering, though, if that generativity in your life, falls short of that ideal of balance. I'm sure it does, and I'm wondering how often. Can that elbow out other parts of life that we need to remember and need to cultivate as well? So I have monotheistic tendencies myself, so I'm curious about the answers.
Well, this is just such a great question, and I really loved what Howard said about, what Howard points out about juggling rather than balance. I personally think balance, I don't think many, even if you look, and it even applies to distribution of wealth, because if you took all the money in the world and took Bill Gates and he gave his $10 to everybody, you'd have balance, right? But you wouldn't have energy. And I think this is, most great things do not get created within a system of total balance at any given time. When I created iVillage, I did not go to the gym every day, okay? It would have been nice, and I would have loved it, but I didn't, okay? So that's your thing. There was a certain burning intensity in the act of creation. Barry Diller says, birth is a horrible thing. That's how he looks at creating anything. It's just so fraught and so engaging. On the other hand, I think this idea of generative is not really just about capitalism. I think it can be about everything in one's life, that everything in one's life, one would aim to have it be generative. And then it becomes exciting. In other words, it's not just, oh my God, everything's focused into generative capitalism. Everything's thinking about how to be generative in all these different realms. Parenting, family, To me, generative is a bit of an idea that the pie is not limited, that there's, love is to me a form of something you can look at as another system. You can multiply it. It's not something where if you give love to one person, you give less to another. So I haven't thought about that connection much, obviously, but I'm interested in it because I don't think it's just in capitalism that this idea prevails. And I do think juggling is a far better metaphor than balance for anything in the world. And I do think concentration of energy and of wealth even is essential to move the world forward and ideas forward. So it's just how it's concentrated and for what motive.
Wasn't it Hillel who said, if I'm not for myself, who am I for? If I'm only for myself, who am I? If not now, when? And I think that's probably something that we don't teach enough. And that's not a balance. It's a creative tension, and much of the energy in life, all energy is at least if I remember my physics, which I don't very much, is a difference in potential. And it's maintaining that difference in potential. And if you look at entrepreneurial communities around the world, they have to have resource mobility. They have to, in fact, reinvest in their community. They have joy in the success of others, and they have to value change. And the second law of thermodynamics says we'll end in stasis, but that's probably not where we want to be.
It's just also funny that the two true card-carrying capitalists here, we both have 7 children. So that speaks a little bit maybe to once you get on the generative role, you want to just spread the love everywhere.
Well, as my wife said, I had to marry her to have a Mormon family.
We're actually out of time. Let's take at least one more question, please.
I have 2 quick questions. One of the moderator, who spent a year studying the ecology of a flourishing life. I'm wondering the boundary conditions you've set on what a flourishing life is, what you've learned. And of the panel, we seem to be, as units of life, whether we're individuals or collectives, whether we're societies, or whether we're the cells which make up who we are, struggling always with survival and identity. And those are selfish quests. And in some sense, your question, how do we move from being acquisitive to being generative, is a movement from being selfish, inner-directed, to being outer-directed. And I'm wondering if the panel has a question on how that is accomplished.
Well, all cells engage in transactions with their environment, otherwise they die. And it's always systemic. I mean, if you don't pass energy through the cell wall, the cell dies. So I think that trying to say and therefore there has to be if there's only a parasitic exchange, the organism doesn't survive. So you have to have the community of cells, each of which is, without getting into Dawkins' work, but I think that what you'd really do is look and say it's a system that allows survival of the individual. And one of the things I think has been forgotten too much at the economics department and even sometimes at the business school, but more at the economics, is community is incredibly important to the survival of any individual. And you don't have to go very far into the favelas of Buenos Aires or Brazil to understand that without a strong community, survival is probably not possible. I can't make my tie, I can't make my clothes, I don't know how to cobble shoes, so I depend on, and the mere fact I have some money to pay for them doesn't mean that I can have them if I don't have a community that surrounds me.
Dan, do either you or Candace want to? Let me just actually, in a sense, perhaps follow up Howard's comment in regard to your question. I do think that my sense of my own well-being is very much tied up with a sense of well-being or flourishing of others. And this would go to back to community, or whether we could use even the notion of or analogy of interactive cells. So this is part of my thinking. And then what sort of an ethic then flows from that, or what kind of a lifestyle then flows from that when I see myself not simply as some sort of atom or in an isolated individual pursuing my own well-being. The communities that we engage in relationship with or in relationship to are obviously vary. So there's the community of family, there's the community of my institution here at Harvard and whatnot. But as a principle, that's important. Just to comment on that also, partly in relationship to some of my own work, but also the comments made by the three panelists. Note that while in many respects the presentations were different and they addressed different issues, there's a sense in which they were all about virtue. And there are certain virtues, or problematic virtues, such as envy and greed, which all three problematized. So again, in terms of we think about human flourishing or enoughness, whatever labels we might put on that, to put it in terms of character or identity or virtue, what are the positive virtues that go with happiness, that go with flourishing? So from a religious, if you will, or ethical or a value perspective, this would be the kinds of data, as it were, the kinds of questions that I would want to put on the table. And then to follow up on that, just one other comment along the virtue line in terms of my work in Buddhism. It's interesting, quite interesting to me, that in terms of sort of classical sets of virtues that one finds in the Buddhist tradition, as they're spelled out in texts, they involve both a limit and an affirmation. A limit not in the sense not seen negatively or a taking away, but as part of flourishing or a part of positive being or virtues, the notion of limit, as it were, is actually built right into it, which I find quite, again, that's a classical tradition and a kind of classical observation about the way classical virtues are discussed. And one could look, obviously, at other classical philosophies and religious traditions and make a similar kind of comment. So I think one of the terribly important things in terms of where we have been, or particularly where we are now, is to see the notion of limit or enoughness, as I think is true for all three of our panelists, as something that is positive, or we could use a term like generativity, like generative, rather than as perhaps in more sort of common parlance, perhaps, we would see it possibly in negative terms, a taking away from, rather than saying it in generative, very positive, creative, constructive terms. I'm sorry that our time is up. I saw several other hands, but we said we would go until 7, and it's 10 minutes after. Would you please join me in thanking our panelists for this excellent discussion?